Hello everyone and welcome back to Rollsicle. More specifically, welcome back to the Magic the Gathering Foundation set review. I kind of forget. I think it's that way, but it might be that way. I think it's that way though, where all of these cards are going to be. But hopefully you guys enjoy it. I finally got the chroma key green screeniness set up. We don't actually own a green screen, but the capturing software that we have allows it to do a green screen around me, and hopefully that looks pretty decent. We'll find out when this video goes up though, right? But if you guys missed it, we already did a Magic the Gathering Foundations. Also, if I look that way a lot, that's where my presentation is for all the cards. So you guys are like, over here is my screen where you guys can see me. But yeah, if you guys missed it, go ahead and check out the Magic the Gathering Foundations set review for the white cards. And now we're going to be on the blue cards. So for those of you that don't know, we're going to be rocking WUBRG, white, blue, black, red, green. And then we'll do multicolored, colorless in one video. And then we may or may not do like the special guests and stuff like that. We'll see. But this is the limited set review, so I'm coming at it from a draft perspective, or at least draft and sealed, but I play a lot more draft than I do sealed. And yeah, I'm going to be ranking every card from 1 to 10. I've learned quite a bit from my first one that went on for a very long time, so I'm going to try to go through the cards a little bit quicker. One good thing of note is that you guys get to see the cards in the video, so I don't really need to read every single line of every single card because you guys can read it. You're capable of reading it. So let's jump into things. Bam. All right, so we're going to start out with Arcane Epiphany, but before we do that, I actually forgot to mention, if you guys haven't left a like on the video or subscribed to the channel, it really does mean the world to us. We're a small channel, so any sort of support, love, any of that, sharing the video, turning on notifications, leaving likes, leaving comments, subscribing to the channel, any and all of it is so appreciated. So let's jump into things. Arcane Epiphany, it's a 5-cost spell that could cost 4 that's going to draw you a good number of cards. It costs less if you own a wizard, and I think it's pretty decent. For those of you that don't know, we're ranking these things from a 1 to a 10. But to be fair, when you see uncommons and commons, they're probably not going to get much more than like a 6 or 7 at best, just because they just are worse than rares and mythics, usually. Now, it's from a limited perspective, and every once in a while you have a rare or mythic that's just completely unplayable in limited. And you rarely see that with the commons and uncommons, because those are basically made for limited, right? You're never going to play most commons and uncommons in other formats. I'm going to give Arcane Epiphany a solid... I mean, it's a good draw spell. I think it's playable at draw 3, pay 5, even if you don't get the wizard payoff, and then it's even better if you do get the wizard payoff, so I'm going to give it a 4. 4 out of 10. It's a solid card. Next, we have the Archmage of Ruins. This is a nice rare. It's a 5-drop, 3/6 with a good 3 and 2 blue there that makes your instants and sorceries cost less, and most importantly, draws you a card every time you cast one of them. Now, this goes insane in many constructed decks, but all things considered, in limited, if you're playing an instant or sorcery style deck like blue-red, this card is just exactly what you need. It's a bomb in that type of deck, and it's good in other decks, but not crazy. So this isn't going to get that instant 10 out of 10 like the Angel did in the last video, but I am going to give it a pretty good score. I think I'm going to land 8 out of 10 on it. So next we have a common here, Big Fin Bouncer. He's a 4-drop 3/2 that bounces something when he enters, so you get to return a target creature an opponent controls to their hand. This can be really good for removing tokens, which are common in this format, so I think that's great. And also, it's just really, really good to answer an opponent's 4-drop or an opponent's 5-drop with your own 4-drop that makes them basically have skipped their turn, assuming that it doesn't have an enter ability. So I really am a big fan of Big Fin Bouncer. And I think that you guys should totally pick it up and draft it if you're drafting, and it should be something you consider a pretty good card. If it's in your sealed pool, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. That's kind of, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. I think it's pretty solid. 5 out of 10. Next, we have the Cephalid, I think is how you say that, Cephalid Ink Mage. It's a wizard, so there's your wizard payoff thing. But I should note, I always forget that this card is even in this format. I don't think to date I have even drafted it one time, so that kind of says a lot. Now, we have Octopus Wizard 2/2. When it enters, you're going to surveil 3, and then it has a threshold trigger, which is basically if you have enough stuff in your graveyard, it does stuff extra. In this case, this creature can't be blocked as long as there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard. I think that's okay, but I also just think that paying 3 for a 2/2 is just unacceptable unless you're very specifically in a threshold deck and you use this card as a way to get there. Now, surveilling 3 is more useful than just threshold because you do get to kind of reorder those cards and put cards that you don't want from your library into your graveyard, which can benefit graveyard synergies, but can also just benefit literally any deck. But I just don't think this is that playable of an uncommon, and anytime I see it, I'm not very excited by it. I think I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. All right, so next we have Clinquant. I think that's how you say that. Sky Mates. This is a bird wizard. A lot of wizard payoffs in blue. 3 and a blue, 1/1 flying. It's as bad as it sounds, but it does get a +1/+1 counter every single time you draw a card. Now, when you draw a card is for each individual draw if you don't know that that's how it works in Magic. So if you play something that makes you draw 3 or 4 cards, you are going to draw a card 3 or 4 times, which means that this would trigger for each card that you draw of those 3 or 4 cards. Now, a really interesting rules question would be, what order does that happen in? Like, do you actually draw 1 card and then this triggers, and then 1 card and then this triggers? Or do you draw all 3 or 4 cards and then get 3 or 4 triggers? That would be really interesting. I'm not sure. I think you would draw 1 trigger, draw 1 trigger, draw 1 trigger, draw 1 trigger, but I don't know for sure. Anyways, I personally think this card is basically unplayable. You can play it if your deck is already very, very, very themed around card draw. And that's going to have a bunch of, we'll get to it later, but a bunch of the 1/2 flying vigilant things, whatever those are called, that let you draw cards. It might have the blue-black staple uncommon that is the one that draws the cards and discards every time that it attacks. Now, you don't actually have to have card advantage to trigger this. You just have to be drawing a card, but I just don't think outside of that deck this card is very playable. I'm actually going to give it a 2 out of 10. It's not that good, but in the right deck, it is playable, and I think almost every horrible card does have the perfect deck for it. It's just this one it has a very, very, very high potential, but you're not going to be hitting that potential very often. And if I play this for 4 mana as a 1/1 and then it gets, it's not shocked, it gets burst lightning, it gets stabbed, it gets hit by that one thing with raid that can do 2 damage to a creature, it's just so annoying. But if you do manage to get those +1/+1 counters on it, it can do really well. I'm still going to land on a 2 out of 10. Next, we have Curator of Destinies. This is a really good Sphinx. Agua. I don't know if you guys could see that. It's actually a protein shake, but I digress. 5/5 flyer that can't be countered, which is really nice. And then, of course, this one is going to be drawing you cards. So whenever this creature enters, you're going to look at the top 5 cards of your library. I'm actually explaining this one because it's a little weird. You look at the top 5, and then you separate that into a face-up pile and a face-down pile. And then an opponent, which I think is target if you don't know for commander, you would get to choose. An opponent chooses one of those piles, put that pile into your hand, and then the other goes into your graveyard. So you get to separate them out, but the trick here is that you get to show your opponent one of them. You also get to keep the other like face down one secret from your opponent. So if you have a really good card, you could put it in the face down thing. Or if you have like a really like bad cards, you could put them in the face down thing. It's very like mind tricky, and I love that card. Like, I love this card. I think this card is incredible. That being said, it does just as good in limited. I mean, we want to be drawing cards, we want flyers, we want big top-ins, we want to be able to cast creatures that can't be countered when there are multiple counter spells in this format. All things considered, I think this is an absolute bomb. I'm going to be giving this a 9 out of 10 in terms of limited. This thing just does exactly what you want it to do. It's got evasion, it's got card draw, it can't be countered, so you've got some safety there. It's a pretty big creature, so it's a comfortable top end. I think it's great. 9 out of 10. All right, so next we have another rare here. We have Drake Hatcher. This is a 1/3 with Vigilance and Prowess that whenever it does damage, it gets incubation counters. That's right, incubation counters in blue. And then if it ever gets 3 of those, you can remove them as an activated ability and create a 2/2 flyer. Now, a 1/3 with Prowess and Vigilance for 2 is already great. This is just why rares are more likely to score above commons and uncommons anyways, because that would just be insane on a common or an uncommon, right? 1/3 with Vigilance for 2 and Prowess, like that alone, already great. Then you tack on top of that, when it does damage to a player, you're getting to put on these incubation counters and you're getting to make some more like board state, and that board state's flying. Really, really, really good card. This is a great Great card to play on turn 2. If it doesn't get answered, you're probably just going to kind of explode out. I absolutely adore this card. I think it's phenomenal. I have a tough time ranking this. It's between an 8 or a 9. I just gave the Sphinx a 9, and I think I'm going to give this a 9 as well. It's obviously not as powerful, but it is a 2-drop, and I think that that's just, it's just insane. If you don't answer this, it has the potential to just get wild, and I think it's like one of the best 2-drops in the game, so, well, in the format. All right, so moving on, I'm going to give that a 9. Moving on, we have the Elementalist Adept. It's a human wizard. More wizard payoffs. I guess the last one was a human wizard. I didn't even realize that. Did not know the Draycatcher was a wizard, so I guess that helps. All right, so we have Flash. That's fine. And then we have Prowess on a 2/1. That's all that there is to this creature. It's simple, but it works in the blue-red, like, instant speed deck. It does things. It's just not incredible. We're going to give it a run-of-the-mill 4 out of 10. I think you can totally play this card, but it's not going to break any sort of games. Next, we have the Erudite Wizard. Of course, another wizard. 2/3 for 3 that says whenever you draw your second card, you're putting a +1/+1 counter on it. I think that's powerful, and it does lean into certain strategies, but it's also only when you're drawing your second card, so you're basically never going to trigger this on an opponent's turn, or very rarely. And then when you do on your turn, it's obviously going to be the second card. It's not whenever you draw a card. That would be way too powerful, understandably, unless it was maybe a rare or mythic. But all things considered, I think this is a perfectly playable card, but I don't think it's anything crazy. In the right deck, it has some potential, but it's definitely not going to pop off. I'm going to give this a 4 out of 10 as well. I think it's just kind of middle of the line. Actually, I might... It is +1/+1 counter, so I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. All right, so next we have Fabloom Trick. I actually really like this instant. This one's really nice. It's a 3-mana instant, 2 and a blue, that creates 2 1/1 flying fairies whenever you cast it, and then on top of that, you get to tap a creature that an opponent controls. So this is just a really good tempo play. If they have something really big that they think is going to be able to swing out, you can play this right before combat, get it tapped before combat. Make sure you do it before you let them move to combat, because then they could attack with it. Doesn't do anything if you've already let their creature be declared as an attacker. So you want to do it before combat. Because it taps them, this can even hit something with like Vigilance. You can also use it at instant speed to stop a blocker that they left back and then kind of swing for lethal. So it's got a lot of combat trick play in there. And then on top of that, you're getting 2 flyers. We know that there's a lot of cards already in the format that like bodies on the field. We also know that flying is a whole sub-theme. Generally speaking, this is just a great card. I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. I think it's wonderful. I don't think it's broken, but I do think it's wonderful. All right, so next we have Grappling Kraken. This is one of Blue's uncommon top-ends. The blue-green deck is a landfall deck, so you'll see landfall on this card. It's a 5/6 for 6. That's okay. It's not great, but it's okay. But mainly you're playing it for this landfall trigger. Whenever a land you control enters, you get to tap target creature an opponent controls and then put a stun counter on it. So this is really letting you play into the control theme of blue. I don't think it's a bad card by any means. I just don't think it's crazy powerful. You have to have a land entering to trigger it. Now, I do like landfall in the sense that when you're in the late game and you're just kind of top decking, it makes it to where if you get a non-land card, you have something to play, and if you have a land, then when you play it, it still has an effect, which is nice, but I just don't think that this card is broken. I will take it over some other top ends, but nothing too crazy. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. I don't think it breaks the format, but I do think it's completely playable. Next, we have the High Fae Trickster. I think this is just a really fun card. It's a 4-mana 4/2 flying fairy, and is a wizard, fun fact. I'm learning more and more how many wizards are in this format. So if you're playing blue, there's a very good chance you're going to have that wizard for that draw card. Anyways, so you can flash her in, and this is what's really interesting. You may cast spells as though they had flash. This is going to get such a high rating for me just because of how cool this card is. I absolutely adore this card. Basically, it turns every single turn you ever play into I untap, upkeep, draw, I pass, basically, right? Unless you're doing something in combat phase, because you can do everything at instant speed. And even if someone is trying to get rid of her and remove her, there's absolutely nothing with split second in this format. So if they're trying to remove her in some way, you can still at instant speed do whatever you were going to do beforehand. and then she gets removed. So this just completely changes how you play the game. It completely changes how much hold you have over your opponent, and you can really lean into the mind game aspect of limited, which I do think once you reach a certain skill point is really where we start to see the differences between really good players and players that are still learning. I would put myself in the still learning category. I certainly know that there are so many times I look back on games going, oh, I should have done this or I should have done that. Maybe I shouldn't have swung. Maybe I should have. And this just tenfold makes them have to question everything. If you leave all of your mana up, they have to go into it assuming you could play literally whatever is in those colors. And so I absolutely adore this card. It's going to get a solid... Oh man, I think I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 because I don't actually think it's so broken, but I do absolutely adore it. It gets a personal score of 10 out of 10, but I do think that functionally, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. Yeah, I like 8 out of 10. Moving on. All right, next we have Homunculus Horde. This card has such potential and also has such just not potential depending on the deck that you build it in. So this is this is basically, what is this? What was that? Scute Swarm is the landfall version of this, where, you know, this is a 2/2 that can copy itself whenever you draw your second card, and then those copies are going to make copies of themselves. So it has the potential to absolutely combo off and go insane. And of course, in the right constructed deck, that's going to be freaking wild, right? But I will say that in limited, I think this is only actually good if you build specifically into it. Otherwise, it's a 4-drop 2/2 that's just not going to do anything unless you can really start comboing it off. Now, if you happen to have the Strix, or you happen to have the blue-black uncommon, or a lot of ways to, even this Icewind Elemental is a one-time way to draw a card, it does help because then you're going to have a lot more triggers of this. But I do think that this is a rare that, once again, only really pops off and only really does its incredible thing when it's in the right deck. That being said, it is a rare that gets really, really, really powerful and hard to remove if it is in the right deck. Once you get this thing to 4 or 5 copies of itself, basically the only way to win that game as the opponent is to have a board wipe or to just overwhelm in the air or something like that, which blue's probably going to be pretty good at defending against. Realistically speaking, this has such a high end, like, will win you games in the right deck, but in the wrong deck, it's definitely not that great. So I'm going to give it a total score of, I think, I've been burned by this card, but I've also played it and gotten absolutely nothing from it. I think we're going to give it a 5 out of 10. And that kind of hurts my soul because I love this card and I want it to be so good, but I think in just most decks it's completely unplayable. In a few decks, it is very, very, very playable. And to be fair, if you pull it early on, you could always build into that archetype, but do remember that in draft, it's always better to find the open lane than it is to try to force one. All right, so moving on to the next one, we have Icewind Elemental. This is a 5-drop 3/4 flyer that lets you, I think it's called looting, when you draw a card and then discard a card. Correct me if I'm wrong about that down in the comments below. So 3/4 flyer that lets you loot for 5. It's okay. There's absolutely nothing to cry home about this card. Like, it's going to give you those draw triggers if that's something that you're already building into, and it is a flyer if that's something that you're building into. But other than that, it's very staple, and you're paying quite a bit in terms of mana cost for it. So I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. I don't think this card is crazy. So next we have Inspiration from Beyond. This is a 3-cost. Mill 3 cards, then return an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to hand. I'm reading this out loud because I don't ever play this card. That should tell you what I'm going to score it, right? Flashback is 5 and 2 blue, and then you can cast it again, of course. Now, this can be playable in the instance and sorcery, like in the instance and sorcery blue-red deck, and in those cases, it's... Even then, I think I would take almost all the other instants and sorceries over it. So because of that, I just don't think this is a very playable card at all. I've almost never seen anyone use it, and even if I have, I've never been blown away by its ability. It's just kind of been completely lackluster. Like, if you're going to get a Burst Lightning with this that you're casting for 1 mana, you're basically casting a 4-mana Burst Lightning, and that's just not usually worth the 2 damage that it can do at that point. I'm not a huge fan of this at all. I don't think it's a very playable card. I honestly think I'm going to give it a 1 out of 10. Don't put it in your deck. Even if you're in instants and sorceries, it's probably not doing what you want. Okay, so next we have Kaido. Kaido's very powerful. As you can see, he's got Mythic, but let's actually read what he does. So Kaido is a 3-cost Planeswalker with 3 loyalty that says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, put a loyalty counter on him. So you definitely want to kind of build wide, and if you're not in a deck that's really building wide, or you want to build with evasion, then, you know, it's going to be rather. It can be a very powerful planeswalker, but you have to be able to get creatures through. So you don't want this to be in a deck where you're just like a couple big creatures, right? Especially if they don't have like trample or evasion. Anyways, so his +1 says up to one target creature you control can't be blocked this turn. Draw a card and then discard a card. So this is just incredible in those draw card decks. Again, if you have Homunculus Horde and this card, yeah, sure, you're triggering it every single turn. But that's an ideal scenario, and we don't rank cards over ideal scenarios. We rank them over realistic scenarios. That being said, you're going to get a loyalty off of this, and then when that creature swings and hits, you're going to get a loyalty off of that because of his passive abilities. So you want to keep that in mind, that this is +1, but it's really +2, right? It's really +2. And then you're going to be getting even more loyalty off of any other creatures that you can get. Now, -2, you get to create a ninja creature token, which is pretty powerful. And then -9 on the actual, like, huge, what's the name of it? Ultimate of the Planeswalker. I completely forgot the word ultimate there. You get an emblem with whenever a player casts a spell, you create a 2/1 blue ninja creature token. Very, very powerful. And of course, in Commander or multiplayer format, that gets even more powerful. But it's still very good and limited to just say, hey, anytime you cast anything, anytime I cast anything, I'm also getting additional benefits. This is all around just an incredible card. You want to play it in every single deck that you can. Even just the top ability is going to benefit you, and for 3 mana, that's completely worth it. Even if this just becomes like 5 damage that you don't take, and you got to draw, you got to loot, and you got to get a creature to be unblockable, that's still worth it. So realistically, I think this is just a phenomenal card. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. I don't think it's quite as balmy as 10 out of 10, but I do think it's really, really close. Yeah, I think it's really, really close. I don't think it's quite a 10 out of 10, but I think it's very close. 9 out of 10 on Kaido. Next, we have Kiora the Rising Tide. I feel like this rare is so much more played than so many of the other rares. I see this all the time. It's a legendary Merfolk Noble for 3/3/2. Whenever it enters, you draw 2 and then you discard 2, so it's going to help it get its threshold trigger, which it does have. But then on top of that, it's also doing the double loot effect, if you will. Whenever it attacks, if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you may create the 8/8 legendary octopus, Scion of the Deep or something like that. Yeah, Scion of the Deep. It's a very powerful card. It's a very good card. I think that that's very clear. I can usually get the threshold trigger whenever I play her in a deck, so I don't think that's too hard to trigger. And I think that generally speaking, the 3/2 for 3 isn't horrible, considering that she's doing the looting effect when she enters. I think that's already playable. And then on top of that, you want to just kind of hold her back until that threshold trigger, attack with her, and she basically turns herself into an 8/8. Maybe even more than that if it doesn't get blocked and killed, but at that point, she should probably get blocked and killed. So realistically speaking, this card is just very good. I don't think it's balmy in the sense that it's guaranteed to win you the game, but I do think it's a very, very strong card. I think I'm going to give it a 8 out of 10, which kind of puts Kaido into perspective that maybe it should have a 10 out of 10. I really need a letter grading scale, and we might switch to that in the next set. Not the next set review. I'm going to stick with the numbers all the way through this, but in the next set, I might switch to letter grading just because that's a little easier in my brain. But yeah, I'm going to give her an 8 out of 10. Next, we have Lunar Insight. Draw a card for each different mana value among non-land permanents you control. Now, if you have a lot of non-land permanents with a lot of different mana values, this becomes draw a lot of cards, but that is by definition a win more card. Realistically speaking, you're going to have 1 or 2 different non-land permanents with different mana values, so this is probably 3 mana draw 2 or 3 mana draw 1. And I think both of those are just kind of unplayable, or there are better options to play than that. I mean, for example, you can do 4 mana draw 3 as long as you just have a wizard, right? And what are the chances that your non-land permanents include a wizard in blue rather than them just being different mana values? Now, I have seen this be a 3 mana draw 5 or 6, and that's insane. But once again, that is by definition win more. If they already have 5 or 6 different non-land, like different mana valued non-land permanents, they're probably already winning the game. So that just, to me, makes this card basically unplayable. I do think that it is possible for it to do good, so it's going to land itself a 2 out of 10 in my book. But it's not great. Next, we have Mischievous Mystic. We have flying 2/1 for 2 that basically says whenever you draw your second card, that's a theme if you haven't caught on to that by now. Whenever you draw your second card, you create a 1/1 blue fairy. This is just incredible. We want to be making more creatures. We want our board to go wide. If we're in a blue-red deck, we definitely want our board to go wide. This is just really, really powerful. I think this is a great 2-drop. I don't think it's quite as strong of a 2-drop as, what was her name? The Drake Hatcher? Something. I don't know exactly, but I think it has Drake Hatcher in the name. I think that's a slightly better one, but this is still incredible. It itself has flying. It's creating creatures with flying. It's all around just great. And if you're in blue, you're probably already doing the whole draw second card thing. So this card just does exactly what you want it to, and that's great. I'm going to give it a solid 7 out of 10. I think it's great. I think it's really, really, really solid uncommon. All right, next we have Refute, which is a common for 3, counter target spell, and then draw a card and discard. Very simple, counter and loot, but counter is very strong in this format. And loot is also pretty strong in this format for your drawing and card triggers. So because of that, well, actually, most of the things is draw your second card per turn, so I guess it doesn't trigger that. But it does trigger, like, the Clinquant or whatever that was called earlier. So it's still pretty good. I think this is generally a pretty decent card. I don't think it's anything crazy, but I do think it's slightly above what I'm looking at as, like, the average for my commons and uncommons, which is where I tend to put them at 4. I want to put this card at 5. If I see a Refute, I really should be taking it. And if you watch some of the Road to Mythic stuff, there are times I didn't, and I certainly wish that I did. Next, we have the Rune Sealed Wall. I really hope I'm going through these faster than I did last time, but I'm not sure if I did. Defender with 0/6 Surveil. Nothing crazy here, literally nothing crazy here, but if you happen to have a like Threshold theme deck, this can be very powerful. If you happen to have a Graveyard theme deck, this can still be very powerful. And it's also just a decent, like it's got a big butt, right? 0/6, that's got some toughness. So I do think this is playable. I just don't think it's great. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. All right, so next we have Skyship Buccaneer. I think this card is perfectly great. It's a 4/3 flyer for 5 that says it has Raid. When it enters, if you've attacked this turn, draw a card. Pretty simple. All you have to do is have attacked. I think that's very powerful, and we love cards that say draw a card. I don't think, again, this is anything too crazy. It really does the effect one time, and then that's it. But I do think it's very powerful, and I'm going to give it a solid, I think 5 out of 10. Is probably where I'm going to land on it. I do love that card, and I do usually get the card draw out of it, which is always nice, but it doesn't feel broken when I do. So 5 out of 10. Yeah, that seems to be about where I want to land with it. Next, we have Sphinx of Forgotten Lore. This is a big boy, so just bear with me. So it's a 3/3 with Flash for 4. Flying, of course, it's a Sphinx. Whenever it attacks, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to its mana cost. So you basically just get to give instants and sorceries without flashback whenever it attacks. Still pretty powerful, still a completely playable card, but it's not as bomby as you would think that it is, unless you're specifically in an instants and sorcery deck, but it is still nice. It's nice to be able to look at any instants and sorceries that you played as long as this is out there, and basically say I get to play these again, and I get to use these as kind of on top of normal combat tricks and ways to affect the battlefield. So that part is really nice. I do think it's very powerful. I just don't think it's completely broken. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. You do want to take this card. I mean, the 4/3/3 flying with Flash is already just better than most commons and uncommons are ever going to be. And then it has the additional benefits, which is why it's going to be landing that 8 out of 10 spot. Next, we have the Strix Lookout, 1/2 for 2 with flying and vigilance. And then, of course, the looting effect of pay 2, tap it, draw a card, then discard. This is very powerful. It's very, very powerful to be able to draw a card and discard in blue in this format if you build it correctly. On top of that, this is a great 2-drop with flying and vigilance. It's going to be able to hit the opponent if they don't have a way to block it. You can put the, whatever it's called, the pickaxe, I don't know the name of it right now, on these flyers, and that's a very powerful combo. I know it's just a common, and it's not crazy powerful, but for a common, this is hitting pretty hard, and because of that, I'm actually going to give this card a 6 out of 10. I love this card. I think it's very powerful, and I do think it's one of the strongest 2-drops that you can play at common in this format. Next, we have Uncharted Voyage. This is a instant for 4 that basically says return target creature, the opponent either puts it on the top or bottom of their library, which is pretty good. If they put it on the bottom, and then you surveil 1. But if they put it on the bottom, it's completely gone. If they put it on the top, then you're guaranteeing that they draw it next turn, so you're basically bouncing a creature and removing them a card draw, so it's not like bounce to hand, it's kind of like bounce to hand, but then they don't draw a card, if you want to think of it in that way. It has played really, really well. It's an instant, so it does benefit those decks. I think all around this card has been completely playable, but I also don't think it's completely broken, so I'm going to give it the 4 out of 10 slot. I think it's perfectly fine, but I don't think it's anything crazy. Next, we have Aegis Turtle. This is a classic, just 1 drop. This is reprint. If you didn't notice the card numbers, I know I blocked the ones on the left, but you'll notice the card numbers. It's over there somewhere. It says 150. We have jumped from 53 to 150, and that's because we've gone from the new cards to the reprints. So these are all reprints, and if I had been around in Magic longer, I would actually have examples of how playable these were before. For example, Aegis Turtle I know is at least from Ikoria. I mean, it says it on its flavor text, right? On Ikoria, blah, 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 blah. But anyways, the Aegis Turtle is perfectly playable, but it's not anything that you want unless your deck is very, very, very themed around control. And that definitely limits how playable it is, so it's going to get a 3 out of 10 vanilla creature here, and it's just a good defender, that's all it is. I don't hate playing this as a 1-drop. If you're playing it against an aggro deck, that's going to be nice, but it's also not getting rid of any of the aggros, right? It's a 0/5. If it was like a 1/5, that would be completely different, right? But it's not. Okay, so next we have an Aetherize. Also, if it was a 1/5 for 1, that would be completely broken. Anyways, next we have Aetherize. This is a classic instant speed. You return all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. Now, this card sounds so powerful. Like, it sounds like it would be completely broken. And I want to assure you that it's not. More often than not, by the time you want to cast this, it's already late into the game, and they're able to bring back out most of their creatures, and they might even get Enter the Battlefield effects because there's a lot of those on cards. There's just... More often than not, I find that this card isn't exactly that playable, and you're holding up 4 mana for it just to hope that they fully swing out. And yes, there are moments where this card absolutely dominates, and someone went from completely winning to completely losing. But if you're setting yourself up, if you're drafting cards or building a sealed deck around the idea that if I'm completely losing, what's going to get me out of that pickle, then this is just going to be complete and utter no gas at all in the situations where you're winning. And that's what you want to be doing more often than not. And so because of that, I think Aetherize is basically completely unplayable. Now, it has its benefits, so I'm not going to give it a 1 out of 10, but I am going to give it a 2 out of 10. Moving on. Brineborn Cutthroat. I love this card. It's a 2-drop 2/1, which doesn't sound great, but it does have flash. And then anytime that you cast a spell... Yeah, just anytime. Nice. Whenever you cast a spell on an opponent's turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So if you have an instant speed deck, flash creatures and instants and those sorts of things, you want to be making sure that you're always casting them on the opponent's turn. But if you are, this thing is just getting bigger. If that's themed around your deck, that's absolutely great. I don't think it's entirely broken. It doesn't quite fuel itself like maybe Cat Collector does and stuff like that. But I do think it's a great card, and it's going to land it a 5 out of 10 from... me. Next, we have Essence Scatter. This is kind of a classic card. Counter target creature spell. That's all it does for 1 and a blue. Now, it's a rather cheap counter spell, right? It's the same price as counter spell, except you don't need 2 blue, but counter spell counters any spell. But generally speaking, people are playing a lot of creatures. People are playing a lot of creatures in Limited, right? It's one of the only ways in formats to play Magic where more often than not, 95% of the time I would say or more, you're winning from attacking and blocking with creatures, right? And that's how most games are playing out. And to be fair, there's a lot of that in other formats, but there's mostly only that in Limited. So this is a totally playable card. I think this card's great. Your opponents are probably going to be playing a creature, and you can probably get a bigger mana value creature with Essence Scatter. So that's really, really nice. I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10 for that as well. I don't think it's broken, but I do think it's pretty powerful. So next we have Extravagant Replication. I feel like I've seen this card a lot. I think physically, Ashley might have pulled this like twice. Also, I forgot to mention, my name's Nathaniel. I'm one of the hosts here at RollCycle. My other host is Ashley. She's out of town right now, but she's absolutely lovely. and I'm excited for you guys to get to meet her more once she's back from holiday. All right, at the beginning of your upkeep, create a token that's a copy of another target non-land permanent you control. Now, it's really interesting this actually isn't a choice, right? I just want to point that out. At the beginning of your upkeep, it doesn't say you may, it just says you have to. So if you have any non-land permanent, you do have to copy it. And every once in a while, in the funniest situations, sometimes that can actually harm you. Like if you have something that does damage to you when it enters, or if you have like a Phyrexian Arena, you can actually sort of kill yourself over time with this card. That being said, it is very powerful, but I want to point out I am always against cards that don't do anything when you actually play them. This literally does nothing when you play it, meaning that you can spend 6 mana, and if your opponent can remove it before your upkeep, it's going to do absolutely nothing. And because of that, I also just don't know if the effect is that powerful. Like, for it to be worth 6 mana, it's kind of got to trigger 2 or 3 times probably. Now, you might get lucky and get a very, very powerful copy with it. But you got to remember, it's if you copy something that's legendary, you're not going to get much out of that, right? So the most powerful things in the format are legendary, so you got to kind of balance that with it as well. I don't think it's bad. Well, I do think it's bad. I don't think it's very good at all. So I'm going to be giving this a solid 4 out of 10. I think it saves itself from being like a 1, 2, or 3 only because it actually does have a very powerful effect. But I wouldn't be putting this in my decks as my top ends. There are better top ends. You're probably playing 2 colors, so look at your other color if you don't have good top ends in blue. But if you can manage to pull like either of those Sphinxes or great top ends, honestly, I'd probably take the Kraken over this for my land drop top end, those sorts of things. So 4 out of 10. Is where it lands. Next, we have Fleeting Distraction. I wonder what set that was from. We have Fleeting Distraction, which is a simple 1 blue instant that gives a creature -1/-0, and then you draw a card. Now, 1 mana draw a card is not anything crazy, but it is nice, and it's also very good in an instants and sorceries deck because the thing that you run into the worst in instants and sorcery decks is running out of cards. So being able to kind of refuel yourself and still give an effect here where a target creature gets -1/-0, that can be enough to really sway a combat between creatures. It's a very powerful card. I absolutely love this card. I think that in the right decks, it works great, but I do think that in the other decks, it's just not that playable, so realistically, it lands itself a nice middle ground at 4 out of 10. Next, we have Imprison in the Moon. I want to take just a moment to ask here, what do you guys think of the enchantment art? That's something that they said they're going to do now going forward for the rest, at least foreseeable future of Magic, is they're going to add this like bedazzled enchantment look to the outside of enchantment cards. I wonder what you guys think about that. Personally, I think it's really cool. I know that they did it for Theros, and now it's just like an all cards thing, which kind of removes some of Theros's like uniqueness, but I think it's pretty cool. All right, so Imprisoned in the Moon is a 3 mana enchantment aura that you pick a creature, land, or a planeswalker, and it turns it into a land that taps for colorless. This is extremely powerful in certain constructed formats, but I just don't think it's very playable and limited because you don't want to be ramping your opponents. More often than not, when you're playing this against a threat, there's got to be better removal than this because you don't want to ramp them into something bigger or more dangerous than what you just removed, right? Now, there are definitely times where they already have 8 or 9 mana out on the battlefield, and I wouldn't hate playing this card, but if I'm saving this for those moments, then it's kind of missed out on most of its playability. So that's going to land at the not so powerful. I think it lands a 3 out of 10. I think it's more playable than what I tend to put at a 2, but I just don't think you should play it. There is a lot more better removal that's going to land in the 4 out of 10 spot, or sometimes even the 5 out of 10 spot. Next, we have Lightshell Duo. This is a reprint, but it's a reprint from Bloomburrow, which is only 2 sets old, so it's pretty new. Prowess, 3/4 for 4, and then when it enters, you surveil 2. Now, this just does a lot, right? The Prowess is going to make this bigger than a 3/4 more often than not in a blue anything deck. And the Surveil is honestly really nice. Surveil has been growing on me as a way to look at the cards that are coming up and kind of help make sure that I'm pulling the cards that I need to be pulling. So I'm going to give this a run-of-the-mill 4 out of 10. I think it's totally playable. Next, we have Micromancer. This is really starting to top off at probably a longer video than last time, but I am trying to speed through this. This is a 3/3 for 4. And when it enters, you get to get back an instant or sorcery with mana value 1, reveal it, and put it into your hand. So this is sort of a selective draw, which is really... search your library. So you don't get it back, you search your library for it. So it is selective draw, which is really nice. Now, it's only instants that are mana value 1, but there are some really good ones. In blue-red, you can go get a Burst Lightning. You can also go get Fleeting Distraction that we talked about earlier. And there's a few other things in different colors and whatnot that you can go get. So, and some things that you can get in blue as well, I think. All things considered, it's a totally playable card. I love that you can draw off of it. It's a wizard. It's still got a decent body on top of the drawing effect. All in all, I like this card. I think it's entirely playable. In fact, I think it's very powerful. So I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. I think it's a little more playable than even some of the others. Next, we have Mocking Sprite. This one's kind of a classic. It's a 2/1 flyer for 2/1 flyer for 3. That makes your instants and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast. Now, making instants and sorcery spells cheaper to cast is very powerful, but a lot of your instants and sorceries are already cheaper, so sometimes having like multiple of these is definitely not going to do much. That being said, I do think it's entirely playable. I don't think there's anything bad about the card, so I'm going to give it the run-of-the-mill 4 out of 10. Next, we have an Offer You Can't Refuse. Now, here you get to pay a single blue to counter target non-creature spell. Now, it doesn't counter a creature spell, only non-creature, which is already not very powerful in Limited. And then on top of that, its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. I think this is completely unplayable in Limited. Absolutely unplayable. Do not ever, ever, ever draft this card. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 10. Next, we have Omniscience. This seems incredible, right? 7 and 3 blue, 10 cost enchantment that says you may cast spells from your hand without paying their mana costs. And I promise you, in Limited, it will be the last card that you play from your hand, and you will have more than enough mana to pay for every card you're going to draw. After that, it does absolutely nothing. 1 out of 10 from a Limited perspective, but of course, if you are drafting, go ahead and pick up this card because it's worth a lot of money. Next, we have Run Away Together. Instant, 2 mana, choose 2 target creatures controlled by different players, return those to their owner's hand. Now, I've only ever cast this spell as a really powerful way to remove someone's creatures or at least bounce their creature. Whew, the yawns got me. I have now seen that this also is an instant, right? So you can use it to protect your creatures. If someone's trying to just to kill it, remove it, exile it, whatever that might be, you can then bounce it back to your own hand as well, while also bouncing something else that the opponent has, which has made this card grow on me in terms of how effective it can be used, which I think has bumped it up from the 4 out of 10 completely playable to the 5 out of 10. This is actually a favorable card. I really like this card. So we're going to give it that coveted 5 out of 10. Next is Self-Reflection, 6 mana sorcery that lets you create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, and then it has flashback for 4, which of course is cheaper than its actual cost. So you want this in your graveyard to create a token that's a copy of target creature you control. That is powerful, but I just don't think you're going to want to spend 6 mana on it, and it's not reliable enough to get it in your graveyard to cast it for the 4 mana flashback cost. And even if you do, that's a lot of setup for not a lot of payoff. So I'm going to give this a 2 out of 10. I don't think it should ever end up in your decks, really. I just don't think it's a very playable card. All right, we're getting there, people. We're getting to the S's and T's here. So Spectral Sailor, I think this is an incredible 1-drop, right? 1/1 flash flying, already great. And then it's got 4 mana, draw a card. You want to be drawing cards in Limited. You want to be drawing cards especially in blue. And then on top of all of that, it's a 1-drop. You can flash it in. It's got flying. There's a lot of potential to this. So it's going to do great in the early game. It's perfectly fine in the mid game, and it's drawing you cards in the late game. So we want this card. I think it's completely playable. I actually think it's really great. Now, its effects don't sound crazy, but it's on a 1-drop, so it doesn't need to be crazy. The fact that it's anything better than just all right for a 1-drop is incredible. I'm going to land it at a... Let's see. Man, I don't know. I think I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. I really wanted to give it 6 out of 10, but I just think it's right off the cusp with that. So next we have Think twice. This is a 2-mana instant that draws you a card, but it has flashback for 3 to draw you another card. If you're in blue-black and you happen to mill this, you still get effects out of it because you can pay 3 to flash it back, even though you never cast it in the first place. I think it's entirely playable. I think drawing cards is important, so you do want to make sure you have these in your deck if you are playing blue, if at all possible. But you don't need to overload it, and they're not going to win you the game by themselves. So realistically, 4 out of 10, totally playable, but it's nothing to cry home about. Next, we have a nice rare in Time Stop. This is a 6-mana end the turn. That's all it does. Now, this can be cast on an opponent's turn. When they have a spell on the stack, it will exile all spells and abilities and everything like that that are on the stack, which is nice. That part is nice. So this does kind of act as a skip their turn. Or, well, it doesn't skip their turn, it ends their turn. But this does act as like an end their turn and counterspell. If you don't know to use it in that way, it's definitely not effective at all. If you do know to use it in that way, it's also usually not that effective. So because of that, I'm going to be giving this a 4 out of 10. I think it is playable. It's definitely in the category of rare that are weaker than some of the commons and uncommons, but it's not in the category of completely unplayable rare. You can get benefit out of Time Stop, but I just don't think I'd put it in most of my decks. All right, looks like we're at the end here. We have Tolarian Terror. You guys know the drill with this one. You've probably seen it before. It's a 7-cost 5/5 with Ward 2, but it costs 1 less for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. This is only playable in that specific deck, but in that specific deck, with instants and sorceries, it is very powerful. So you kind of want to weigh that. If you're heavy into instants and sorceries, this can be a great card to have multiple of because you just know you're going to have 3 or 4 instants and sorceries in your graveyard. So this is regularly going to be a 3 or 4 drop 5/5 with Ward 2. That's great. You definitely want that. But it's also very limited in the fact that most other decks aren't going to want this at the top end. You basically never want to pay 6 or 7 mana for this as a 5/5 with Ward 2. So because of that, I think I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. I do think its benefit is there, but just know this is like a 1 out of 10 in any deck that's not heavy in instants and sorceries. But I am going to give it a 4 out of 10 overall. And then lastly, we have Witness Protection. This is an enchantment aura that you enchant a creature, it loses all abilities and becomes a 1/1 power and toughness. Base 1/1 power and toughness. You become a green and white citizen creature. I've seen this actually pop off. I actually think this is a really powerful 1-drop enchantment. I've seen some of my biggest creatures just turn into a 1/1 that I have to just chump block into something. That being said, it does not remove the creature. It turns it into a 1/1. I do think the power is there, but I just don't think this is completely broken. I think there was potential for this to be better than it was, but with what it actually does, it's going to land in that normal 4 out of 10 category. I do think this is pretty decent removal in blue though, so if your other color has been lacking what removal it can give you, I would take some Witness Protections and be happy with them because ultimately it's probably going to benefit me. You also have to remember, since it removes abilities and stuff like that, this is going to be able to like get rid of flyers or reach to block, to keep your evasion up. It can also get rid of death touchers. And then of course, if they do play a bit of a bomb, it can also get rid of the bomb. So now you also have to keep in mind it's an enchantment. So enchantment removal can get them their card back, but that's kind of the balance that you play. And that, is the set, or at least is the blue cards in the set. So we run all the way back through these and we get back to our Magic the Gathering Foundation set review blue cards. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This was a long one, but if you enjoyed it, please let me know down in the comments below. Obviously, we're going to have the rest of these black, red, green multicolor colorless for you guys. But again, to save me talking for like 5 hours, we're going to be doing them in separate videos. If you did enjoy it, please let us know down below. The likes are greatly appreciated. Notifications are great if you want to be notified whenever we put out a video, but it is pretty consistently been every day for a while and will at the very least stay probably every other day, even once school begins to kick back in for me and Ashley. And then of course, please, 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 if you haven't, a subscription to the channel means the world to us and it helps our channel grow each and every day. Thank you guys for being the absolutebomb.com. You guys are killing it in support of the channel and we just love making these videos for you. I hope all the rolls are in your favor. May those rolls be ever in your favor. And we'll see you guys next time. Peace out.